Let me give you an overview of how the week is going to proceed. Actually, before we do, I want to make one introduction. We have one member of the group who didn't arrive in time for the dinner last night, Fanya Musaeva. You want to stand up and just briefly introduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Fukuyama. I'm from Kazakhstan, from Stanford. I'm a social and economic policy consultant. I've been working for UNICEF and OEC and India before. And I'm also summer fellow on development and democracy.
So I should explain that Stanford's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law actually has two parallel programs. And so one of them is this Leadership Academy, and the other one is called the Draper Hill Summer Fellows Program. And they're both designed for mid-career professionals. The delivery models are a little bit different. So in the Leadership Academy, we go out to different countries and present the program as we're doing here. In the Draper Hills program, we bring people to Stanford for an intensive 3-week program. And mixed in with all of the Georgians, you'll see quite a number of people that are graduates, including Nino from the EPRC, who had been a summer fellow, I guess, 3 years ago or something like that. But I think it's important because that's going to bring a different perspective, because most of those people in the other program are not in the public sector. They're in civil society or work in different kinds of organizations and are more geographically varied. One thing I would like to say is this is a class. You're all students. You do not need to wear neckties. So if you want to take off your neckties, I'm not going to wear a necktie the entire week. So please feel free to get a little bit more casual. It is a case-based program. It is extremely important that you interact. And as you'll see, you're going to be divided up into groups and you will stay in your groups the entire week. The groups will be very important. We're going to do roughly one lecture and two cases every day of the program, except for the final day. And the way the cases are going to work, have any of you done like a Harvard Business School type case-based teaching program previously? No, all right, so it's a very different kind of activity. So we're going to begin with a lecture. I'm just, after I give this introduction, I'm going to stand up and give a straightforward lecture. I hope it'll be interactive, but the cases are going to be very, very different. Before we begin the discussion of the case, you are going to meet in your groups. We'll put the group assignments up for you to see. There are breakout rooms that the staff will direct you to. So before the case begins, you will go in your groups to the breakout rooms. The syllabus has study questions for each of the cases. As I said last night, it is absolutely critical that you read the cases and absorb them before the class. If you don't do that, you won't get anything out of it, because the cases are all about local context. They've got a lot of details. Mostly, they're two Georgian cases, so the Georgians will be probably somewhat familiar with those, but the other cases are going to involve very specific situations, like the one that Alan Traeger is going to do tomorrow on the New York City Parks Commission. You won't know anything about it, and if you sit through a case without having read it very carefully ahead of time, you won't know who the people are, you won't know the local situation, and unlike listening to a lecture, you'll get nothing out of it. So it is really important that you read the cases very carefully. So the groups will meet for half an hour before the case discussion, the broad case discussion begins, and in the groups, you will answer the study questions. You as a group will discuss the study questions among yourselves, and you will come to an answer for the different study questions. Then we'll come back into this room, and then we will begin the general case discussion, all right? And that's the procedure for all of the cases that we're going to do. The cases are written in a very specific manner. They all revolve around a single decision maker and a single decision that decision maker has to make, all right? And the purpose of this is to put you in the position of that decision maker so that you will have to confront the same kinds of choices and trade-offs that that person engages in. Now, I should give you a little bit of the kind of ideology of the Leadership Academy because it's an attempt to think about government in a slightly different way than many people are trained to do. All right? Many of you who are in the public sector are trained as technocrats, meaning you have an education, your background, you're an agronomist or a health professional or an economist or something of that sort. You are hired into the government to use those technical skills to deal with different kinds of policy problems. That is good. Government needs capacity. It needs this kind of expertise. But in order to actually implement any policy, you need a slightly different set of skills. In addition to your technical knowledge about whatever specialty you have as a policy professional, you also have to know how to implement. Meaning you have to deal with the policy environment and all of the obstacles that environment creates. Many of those obstacles are completely political, all right? And if you look around the world, there are many things that governments would like to do, and you'll see many examples of this in the actual cases, where you cannot get to where you want to go. We're going to start, the first case that Alan Traeger will teach is on the Hyderabad Municipal Water and Sewerage Board. So this is the board that is responsible for providing clean water to the growing high-tech Indian city of Hyderabad. And that organization cannot provide as much as 50% of the population of that city with clean water, right? And it should be pretty straightforward in order to do this, but as you'll see in the case, they're not able to. And the question then is, what is preventing this high-tech city from actually providing clean water? And you'll see that the answer to that is most of those obstacles are political in nature, that there are interest groups, there are stakeholders, there are participants in the process that actually don't want things to change, right? And if you're a technocrat that's sitting there, let's say you're a water engineer, and you're trying to figure out, how do I improve water supply? Nothing you've learned, about water or the technicalities of providing clean water is going to help you solve that problem, because it is essentially a political problem. And unless you have the broader perspective where you can think like a politician in a certain way, take into account all of the surrounding constraints, and then learn how to maneuver through them, you're not going to be able to implement a successful reform policy. And as we'll see, we'll summarize this as we go through the different cases, but this involves something that we call stakeholder analysis, where basically you need to figure out who are all the stakeholders, that is to say, the different actors in your situation who have some interest in the outcome. Some of them are going to be friends of yours, that is to say, some of the stakeholders are going to want you to succeed. So if it's providing clean water, they're consumers, they're businesses, there are lots of people that want the reliable supply of clean water, but there are also a number of stakeholders that don't want you to succeed. They may be entrenched, public sector unions. They may be people that want, as we'll see in Hyderabad, there are actually a lot of poor people that are stealing water, and they don't want to lose that privilege of being able to get free water, and so forth. And so the solution to the problem is really to actually implement a solution. It means figuring out who those stakeholders are, building a coalition of people that are in favor of the change, and then figuring out how to neutralize people that cannot be reconciled to the kind of policy reform that you want to do. All right? So that's the overall, I think what we are going to try to add is thinking beyond your technical specialty and doing this very simple kind of stakeholder analysis that then allows you to look at real-world solutions to these problems. The cases are written in a way that there's no right solution. And in fact, we tried to build our cases. We've commissioned most of them that are in your packet, but some of them come from the Harvard Kennedy School as well. And it's important to understand that most of the cases, it's not as if you're being asked to come up with the correct optimal solution to these problems, because they are implementation problems. And the strategy for implementing, you know, there are going to be alternative strategies and there'll be trade-offs. Some of them will be, you know, straightforward, others will be very complicated, and that's part of your task in the groups, is to think through those trade-offs and to, you know, not to come up with the right solution, but to argue in favor of a path forward that will get you to where you want to go. Okay? Now this is going to be interactive, so I'm going to stop here and ask whether anyone's got any questions so far about how we're going to proceed with the cases. Okay, well, there'll be questions, so don't worry, we'll get there. Okay, so let me now proceed to explain. You've got the syllabus, and as I said, there will be a lecture and then cases that are going to be related to the theme of the lecture. So, for example, Professor Traeger will do a lecture on public-private partnerships and then follow that with the New York City Parks case, which is a case of a specific public-private partnership. So, yeah, so this just goes over what I simply said. Now, in addition to the class time that we're going to spend on cases and lectures, you're also going to be tasked with doing a group project. And you will be in the same groups that discuss the study questions. And that group is going to spend the week developing a presentation that you will do on Friday morning to the entire group as a group, all right? And let me just go over what's required for that. All right, yeah, so this is simply an overview of the different topics that we are going to cover in the course of the week. And as you can see on day 5, we've reserved the entire morning. We'll have you do some evaluations of the course, but it's going to be reserved for the final presentations. So this is what you're supposed to do for the final project. You're going to meet the first time at the end of the day today in the groups, and you will have gotten to know each other at that point. I suspect a lot of you know each other already, but not everybody knows everybody else. And you need to start discussing what the final topic ought to be. We want you to, on the second day, provide a 1 or 2 paragraph discussion of the topic that you've agreed on. Now, in choosing the topic, it has to be a problem that one of you is wrestling with. Okay, all of you are dealing with these kinds of implementation issues in your normal work life, and so it can really be anything. It's very important that you think about this in terms of problems. A lot of the effort to reform the public sector to deal with things like pervasive corruption or poor capacity and the like has been very abstract. And part of the reason that a lot of the programs run by the World Bank or USAID, with all due respect to our sponsors here, a lot of them tend to be, you know, more generic kinds of programs that are, thank you, that are designed to deal with a generic problem. In our experience, that kind of reform almost never works because it doesn't, nobody has a general interest in eliminating corruption. I mean, of course, everybody would like corruption to disappear, but you can't take on corruption, in a whole society. It has to be done on a very specific sector-by-sector basis, and generally speaking, unless you're trying to actually solve a particular problem, like you want to make a big investment, let's say in an infrastructure project, and then you want to minimize corruption in that infrastructure project, that is a manageable problem. That is something that you can actually deal with. It is very hard to deal with corruption in the civil service more broadly, all right? So the groups need to meet, and you need to talk about problems that you are dealing with, and your project for the rest of the week, and we've laid aside time for group meetings at the end of every day's session, you will generate a solution to the particular problem that you've decided on the first couple of days. So as the week goes on, you will get into it. We hope that you will provide a PowerPoint presentation on the final day. You will each have approximately 30 minutes to make the presentation and to get questions back from the group. All right? So is all of that clear? All right, any questions about any of that? So we'll give you a lot of help, and the faculty will be going around kind of sitting in on the groups just to listen to your discussions, and if you need any suggestions or help, and we'll try to monitor how you're doing and the like. Second day, you need to give us a one or two paragraph description of your project. By the final morning, you'll have a draft presentation and the final PowerPoint presentation. By the way, if this is a real problem that some of you are dealing with on an ongoing basis, we're actually interested in following up on that even after this course is finished. Now, our plan, if this really works, is to continue working with Ilias State University and with the EPRC, and we're going to come back. And hopefully, this will not be just a one-time training session where you all have a good time this week learning things, and then that's it. Because in our experience, after a few weeks have gone by, a lot of this, whatever you've absorbed tends to get dissipated and so forth. So we'd like to come back to Georgia and re-engage with you. And if any of you are actually attempting to solve the problem that your group has come up with, we'll continue to work with you and to follow up on it. All right. Let's see. Yeah. So this is what should be in the final presentation. So we want you to outline the problem. A lot of it has to be, like in the cases, simply descriptive, what the problem is, why it's a problem, why it needs to be solved. We want you to give us some alternative solutions to the problem. We want you to walk us through a stakeholder analysis. And this is the critical point, right? This is where the politics comes in. Like, who cares that this problem gets solved one way or the other? Who's in favor and who's opposed and the like. And then, an analysis of some of the impacts and outcomes. And then finally, your group's recommendation for how to proceed. Okay? Is that reasonably clear? All right. Well, since I've got this thing up on slides, and by the way, we will distribute all of this. Nino will get the slides to you so that you can look at them again. And in fact, the lecture that I'm about to give you on the state and the private sector is also up on YouTube. So if you didn't catch any of that, you'll be able to actually watch a video of it in the privacy of your own, rooms and so forth. Okay, so let me just review what I said about stakeholder analysis, all right? There's basically these two approaches to solving problems. There's a technocratic approach. I have nothing against technocrats. In fact, if governments don't have technocrats, they're not going to know how to do good policy, right? The technocratic approach tells you what the optimal policy is. But I would say that beyond that, you need a more political kind of approach to analyze, as I said, the constraints, really, that are preventing you from getting to where you're going. And again, this is an important point. Bad policies can come about because you've got a bad solution, right? You're doing something really inefficient. You're not sending good price signals, or you're over-regulating and so forth. We'll go through, some of those possibilities, right? But a lot of times the problem is not, this one of not knowing what the right thing to do. The problem is on the implementation side, and it really has to do with dealing with these obstacles. And so this is what's called political will. I don't like the term political will, actually, but it's used a lot in this sort of analysis. The thing I don't like about political will is this idea that, somehow it makes you think that the problem is just like having a good breakfast in the morning. That a policymaker gets up in the morning and says, okay, this time I really want to push through my policy and I'm going to eat, a really healthy breakfast and have a lot of energy, and that's going to give me the will, just like an athlete, to accomplish what I want to do. That's not the way it works. That's not what political will consists of. Political will is really a kind of metaphor for coalitional politics. What political will is pulling together a coalition of like-minded people that want to have the same objective as you. And this is what any politician from the beginning of time has ever done. You have to bring like-minded people and you have to persuade people to get on your side of policy change. And so when you're doing the stakeholder analysis in your projects and in thinking about the different cases, you've got to put all the stakeholders in these three categories. People that are your allies, people that are your opponents, and then people that are in the middle. Because a lot of the stakeholders will actually be kind of neutral and won't have a strong opinion one way or another. And then you need to proceed by figuring out how to pull together a coalition of your supporters, figuring out how to neutralize. Now, the word neutralize in some contexts has a pretty nasty meaning. There are some countries in which you neutralize your opponents by sending out an assassin or, putting them in jail and that sort of thing. We're talking here primarily about democratic countries operating under some kind of a rule of law. So neutralizing your opponents basically doesn't mean, destroying them. It simply means getting them to get out of the way of whatever it is that you're trying to do. And then the people that are in the middle, the neutral ones, are ones that you have to bring over to your side, right? You, at a minimum, want to prevent them from standing in your way, but at a maximum, you actually want to convince them to be friends of yours, and that requires communications. It requires persuasion, it requires negotiation, and so that becomes part of the mix. So we're going to go back to this after you've seen several examples of this, but every case that you do, there'll be stakeholders, and there'll be sometimes a stakeholder analysis is actually embedded in the case, but if it's not, you need to think about that, and you need to think through who the stakeholders are. And then the strategy for, as I said, working with friends, neutralizing opponents, and persuading the neutral. Okay? Any questions about anything as we proceed? And there have to be some questions. All right, I guess everything I've said is so clear that no one's got any problems. So let's proceed now with the opening lecture.
Good morning. I want to add just one point based on meeting quite a few of you last night. My focus often is economic. And many of you have had exposure to the private sector or work in the private sector, especially those of you who work in finance. So we want you to be thinking, of course, just as Frank described, in terms of the political issues that will allow you to create a path toward a solution. But I'm also interested, quite interested, in the value or the different values of the assets associated with the problems you're trying to solve. Economic value and public value. So we're going to be looking to solve problems that may involve pricing or the creation of value or even the destruction of value. So that expands your mind while you're thinking about this. And this should definitely show up in your presentations. When you're thinking about solving a problem, some of your stakeholders will only have an economic mindset.
With this introductory lecture, which is just going to begin with some basic concepts to understand the relationship of the state and the sector, all right? You cannot have development without economic growth, and you cannot have economic growth without a healthy private sector. And the relationship of government policy to the growth of the private sector is really the topic that I want to cover right now. So let's just begin by thinking about what it is that the government is and does. So we have representatives from a lot of different agencies here in Georgia that do a lot of different things, and modern governments engage in lots of activities. Now, this chart comes from the 1997 World Bank World Development Report. That report was called The State in a Changing World. It was a very important document from the bank's standpoint because it marked the end of the Washington Consensus, the so-called Washington Consensus. Now, the Washington Consensus was the kind of conventional economic policy that was coming out of international development institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund during the 1980s and 1990s. Does anyone want to tell me what that was about? Like, what were the sorts of policies back then that were being advocated? And by the way, this was the dominant mindset at the moment that the Soviet Union broke up and Georgia became an independent country. So what kind of advice was coming out of, the United States and, Europe and places like that back then? Yeah, privatization, liberalization, getting rid of excessive government regulation, free trade, reducing tariff barriers, and the like, all right? Now, this is not a bad agenda under the right circumstances, but I think that the mistake that was made, and I have to say this was made by a lot of American policymakers at the time, was not recognizing that government actually has a very critical role to play in promoting the development of the private sector. This was the period after the rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who both were famous for, in a sense, arguing that government was the big problem. Ronald Reagan, in his first inaugural, I know that Ronald Reagan is held in great esteem in many parts of the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so forth. And he did play a really important role in shifting the way we think about government. But in a certain sense, there were problems in that, from that standpoint. Ronald Reagan, in his first inaugural address, says, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem." And that led to a 15, 20-year period in, where policymakers basically believed that the government was only an obstacle to the growth of the private sector. And, really, I think in large part as a result of what happened in the former Soviet Union with the collapse of the Soviet state and then the emergence of new states in places like Georgia, there is a realization that, hey, wait a minute, if you don't have government at all, that's not a good situation either. You had the rise of mafias, of uncontrolled privatizations, and the like. And so by 1997, the thinking in a lot of Washington institutions had shifted back to a new appreciation that the state actually had an important role to play. And this 1997 World Bank report was actually the first time that the bank was admitting, yes, the state actually is important, all right? Why is it important? So this chart, taken from that report, basically divides government functions into three categories. So they have on that x-axis minimal functions like providing basic public goods, intermediate functions like addressing externalities of different sorts, and then activist functions which have to do with the provision of, let's say welfare state, social services, income redistribution, industrial policy, and the like. So this is a good starting point for understanding where the government actually helps and where it hurts. And it's going to be very important to have a theoretical understanding of that when you think about how do you promote the private sector. All right, so let's begin with this question. The most basic role that governments play has to do with providing what economists call public goods. Most economists, I hate to make generalizations like this, but I think in this case it's true for many of them. They tend not to like government intervention in private markets. But every economist, beginning with the most libertarian ones at the University of Chicago, will all say that there are certain basic functions that governments must provide, otherwise a market economy will not work, and that begins with the definition of a public good. All right, how many of you have taken basic microeconomics? I assume a lot of you have. Yeah, okay. All right, so you should be able to, I know you probably have not been examined on this for a very long time, but I'm going to ask you, what is the economist definition of a public good? Someone want to volunteer this? There are two characteristics that define a public good. Yes? Non-excludable, non-rival. Okay, so let's go over that. Two conditions, they're non-excludable and non-rival. All right, so, or non-depletable is another term for it. So a public good is non-depletable in the sense that you can't run out of it, all right? A private good you can run out of. Like if you're making a Gucci or a fancy handbag, there's not an infinite supply of these handbags, and so any given handbag you can sell as a private good and you can make money on because you've got the handbag and other people don't. Public goods are non-depletable in the sense that there's more where it came from. The second characteristic has to do with non-rival. Non-rival meaning if I appropriate that good, it doesn't mean that no one else can make use of it, right? Now, why are these two definitions important? So what's the essential difference between a public good and a private good? Right? A private good is something that private companies make, they sell, they make money off of it. So how is a public good different if they have those two characteristics?
Because larger externality.
Sorry?
Because larger externality.
Yeah, and
you probably need larger resources to actually provide it.
Yeah, well, not necessarily, but let me put it this way. So a private good, companies produce them because they want to make money off of them, right? Can you make money off of a public good? You can't, right? Because of these two characteristics being non-depletable and non-rival, right? If you can't keep somebody from enjoying something, like clean air, then you can't sell it, right? If you have cleaned up the air of Beijing or New Delhi, which are two cities that have really terrible air, you can't say, okay, well, only rich citizens are going to get good air and the poor citizens are not. Everybody is going to benefit from having clean air in a place like that, right? So that means that the incentives for any private organization to provide something like clean air is non-existent, right? Nobody is going to want to do that because you can't make money off of it, right? So that's the essential characteristic of a public good. There are things that are of general benefit to the public, but they are non-rival and non-depletable, and it means that no private company can profit off of it, and that is a classic reason why the state has to be involved in their production. So I gave you one example, clean air. Do you want to give me some other examples of classic public goods? Yes. Okay. I believe that, yes, that's the first on my list. National defense. Actually, I should have not put that whole list up all at once, but these are some examples, right? You've got an army. The army is defending your national borders, and it's not defending, some citizens, but not others, all right? And in a well-functioning country, the police force, unfortunately, this doesn't always work, but a police force provides public order. It catches criminals, it punishes people that break the law, and it doesn't do it selectively just for some citizens and not for others. You can buy private security, and in many countries with rampant crime, rich people do that. They buy their own security guards that protect only them, but if you want to get protection in a city, like here in Tbilisi, basically it's not efficient just to protect some citizens and not others, and therefore it's something that is a benefit to other people. So public safety, clean air and clean water, actually these are not completely pure private goods, as we're going to see in the Hyderabad case. Think about those two characteristics, non-depletable and non-rival. Let's take the case of clean water, because we're going to do this in the next case. Is clean water a pure public good? Well, okay, is it?
Not necessarily, not in all circumstances, no.
Yeah, is it, for example, is it non-depletable? Right, so clean water is depletable, right? There's a finite supply of clean water. So in that sense, it is not a pure public good. Is it non-rival? Well, it could be, let's say if you've got a stream that's got fresh water in it. So, okay, let's take an example. You're living in a village by a stream. There's lots of water in the stream. It's all clean. So in that sense, it's a public good because it's non-depletable and non-rival. Anyone can take it. On the other hand, your city grows, there's a large population, and all of a sudden people are taking too much water out of the stream, so there's not enough left over. That means it is depletable. So in that respect, it's not a public good. Right? This is one of the problems, is that water, clean water and clean air, sometimes under certain circumstances are not pure public goods. They are what economists would call a common pool resource, meaning that they are depletable, but they're non-rival. Right? You can deplete them, but you can't prevent other people from taking them. And there's a lot of examples of that. So like an underground aquifer that has fresh water in it, right? That's non-rival because anyone can drill a well and get the water out of the ground, but it is depletable. And if too many people drill wells, they'll drop the level of the aquifer and then there won't be any water left, right? So it has characteristics that are like a public good, but are not completely that way, and we'll see in the Hyderabad case that this is actually very important. Public infrastructure is another kind of classic case. Airports, roads, electrical, connectivity, broadband, internet, all of these sorts of things are usually done by public companies because it's very hard to make money off of it for a whole variety of reasons. They have a monopoly characteristic in most cities. It doesn't make sense for numerous companies to, provide pipes taking water into your house. Usually there's only one set of pipes, and that creates a situation of a natural monopoly. All right, public health, all right, is another classic case of a public good where having a disease-free environment, being able to run public clinics to take care of disease outbreaks and the like, is a classic state function. All right, second category, economists would say that private markets are not sufficient on their own, has to do with externalities. So let's go back. What's the definition of an externality? Yeah?
As far as I remember, it's an external cost or benefit which is imposed on the third party without him or her willing to.
Okay, that's right. That's basically it. So here's the definition. All right, so an externality is a harm or a benefit imposed on a third party to a transaction, right, that is not part of the transaction. So the classic example of an externality is toxic waste dumped in a river, right? You've got a chemical factory, you're upstream of a village, you want to get rid of your toxic waste, so you just throw it in the river. You don't have to worry about the cost of cleaning up that toxic waste. It doesn't hurt you because it's all going downstream, but it hurts the people who are dependent on that river as their water supply, right? That's the classic case of a negative externality. And the chemical plant has no incentive to not do that because that's the least costly way of operating. And that's why, in general, governments are called upon to regulate in that kind of a situation, right? The private market by itself is not going to deal with preventing that harmful externality from being imposed on other people. But there are also positive externalities. And a classic case of that is education. Now, education is a private good in some sense. Like, I will be willing to pay for my own college education because it's going to allow me to get a better job after I graduate, right? But it's also got a lot of spillover effects that help a lot of other people besides me. So if I learn how to be a great civil engineer, it helps the company that employs me as an engineer. And that's why most governments provide free public education, at least primary and secondary, because it is of general importance and benefit to the economy. And so that's a classic case of a positive externality, all right? So this gives us a basis, when we think about state and the private sector, there are certain critical things that states really have to provide. And if they don't provide them, your economy is going to have real problems. So that has to do with public goods and minimizing negative externalities, promoting positive ones, all right? So this then begins our list of what we want to get at is where should states intervene and where should they not intervene, all right? So we're going to build this list, and this is the beginning. So providing public goods and regulating positive and negative externalities. Okay, now if you go back to that original list, in fact, let me go back here a second. All right, so we were dealing with the minimal functions of the state when we talked about public goods and externalities, and so now we're moving into slightly more sophisticated state functions, which has to do with information asymmetries. All right, so what's an information asymmetry? Well, classic case of this has to do with selling cars. This was a famous article by an economist, George Akerlof, who actually he happens to be the husband of Janet Yellen, who's currently the chairman of the US Federal Reserve. But he wrote this article called The Market for Lemons. And he said, why is it that, generally speaking, when you buy a used car, the seller of the used car can never get the full value that the car is actually worth? And he said the reason has to do with information asymmetries. That is to say, the seller of the car knows the history of the car. And so if there's a mechanical defect in the car, they're going to know that, but they don't have to tell the buyer about that, right? The buyer doesn't know. And the buyer ahead of time realizes that he may be buying a lemon being a term for a used car that doesn't work very well. But because the buyer does not have that information that the seller does, they're not going to pay as high a price to hedge against the risk that they're going to be sold a bad car, all right? And in general, there are many economic transactions in which the sellers have much better information than the buyers do. And so a classic argument for government intervention is to correct information asymmetries. And there are a lot of them in a modern economy. So food and drug safety. So this was actually a advertisement from the early 20th century in an American medical journal for a tonic that claimed that it would make you, young and healthy and vigorous. And this was before there was such a thing as the US Food and Drug Administration. Basically, any maker of a so-called patent medicine could make any kind of advertisement and make any sort of claim for the effect of that product. The manufacturer might know that the product was completely worthless, and in fact, a lot of times they would sell drugs that were positively harmful. They contained arsenic or cocaine or other, addictive things, and they passed them off as helpful medicines. And the whole reason that we have a Food and Drug Administration is to correct that information asymmetry, right? It's to make sure that if you buy a drug, the drug maker has to test it for safety and efficacy. They have to prove to the FDA that their medicine will not harm you and that it will actually have the positive effect. And the way they do this is by forcing drug makers to run these double-blind, randomized trials in which the drug is given to one group of patients and a placebo is given to the other group so that you can statistically prove that the drug does what it says it does. That's why drugs are so expensive. Drugs would be really, really cheap if you didn't have the Food and Drug Administration, but you'd also have no guarantee that they would actually work, right? So this is a cost of doing business, and government is the one that can play this role. Securities and Exchange Commission, same thing. When you sell a security on a public market, on a stock exchange, the insiders in the company know whether the company is going to lose money the next quarter because of an impending regulatory action. but the buyers of the stock may not do that, and so that's why you have something like the SEC that forces companies to disclose everything. So in theory, an outside purchaser of the company's stock is going to have exactly the same information that the insiders have. So a fourth reason that you get involved, that the government tends to get involved in regulating private markets, has to do with, as I mentioned, natural monopolies, which usually have to do with provision of water, electrical power, telephones, and the like. So there are private monopolies. This was, again, from the 19th century when Standard Oil tried to corner the oil market in the United States and was broken up by government action. But more typically, they have to do with, activities that involve connections where it's not efficient to be anything other than a monopoly provider. So as I said, it doesn't make sense to run multiple pipes carrying clean water into people's houses, and that's why telephones, electricity, water, things that we associate as public utilities tend to be done monopolistically. And if a monopoly is run by a private individual, what happens? There's actually, if you take microeconomics, there's a very clear outcome to this, right? The private monopolist raises the price because they can to what's called the monopolist kind of optimal price, which is not high enough to drive everybody away from the service, but it's high enough to maximize the revenues of a monopolist. Now, this is something that happens in the early 1990s. The government of Mexico, under Carlos Salinas, privatized their state-owned telecom company. They sold it to a private individual named Carlos Slim. Does anyone know what happened to Telmex after that? Yeah, so Carlos Slim is like the richest man in the world today. And he's rich because he owns a private monopoly on telecom services in Mexico. And the problem is that the Mexican government privatized this natural monopoly, did not make provisions for ensuring competition in the telecoms market. And as a result, ever since then, Mexico has had one of the highest rates of telephone charges of any developing country. The government, this latest government, finally got around to try to crack that monopoly and encourage greater private competition in the telecoms market. But this is the result, and this happened in the former Soviet Union repeatedly, where a government monopoly was replaced by a private monopoly, and it actually made things worse because there's no argument for privatization in the case of a private monopoly, right? Unless you have competition, privatization does you no good whatsoever, all right? And so if we continue down the list of things that governments do, we get to things like regulating behavior. So this is where I'm going to ask you, how much behavior, and by behavior, there's a lot of things. Governments don't like gangs. They want people to stop smoking. They want them to lose weight. They want them to, observe. I mean, I guess the Russian government just now wants its prisoners not to swear, use bad language and this sort of thing. How do we come to a judgment as to what's the appropriate level of regulation of behavior?
It's very difficult.
Are there any general, yes?
The level of democracy the country wants to follow.
Level of democracy. So does that mean the more democratic you are, the less you're going to try to regulate behavior?
Yeah, personal freedom and values like that.
Okay. So there's a core of individual freedoms that every democratic country is committed to preserving, right? Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom, so forth. So we're pretty much agreed on those, but do governments actually just stick to that basic list? I mean, take my country, the United States. We regulate all sorts of things, right? I mean, we've been on this big anti-smoking campaign for the last 30, 40 years. How do we do it? Well, we pile on taxes onto, I mean, this is something that Catherine's been looking at in Russia. So tell everybody what the Russians are doing right now.
So they have banned smoking. There are a couple Russians in the room, right? So they probably,
Yeah, we have several.
yeah. So they banned smoking in all public places, including buildings, hotels. You can smoke on the street, but there are regulations about how close to a bus shelter you can smoke. And then they've introduced regulations, very tight regulations on point of sale, so that you actually have to look at a price list of cigarettes and then tell the cashier what you want, but they're not displayed, particularly at the level of a child, as tobacco companies generally like.
Okay, right. So in terms of regulating smoking, this is not something that's protected in the U.S. Bill of Rights, right? There's no right to smoke a cigarette. And there's also no right to be free of government regulation of smoking, right? But we do this anyhow. Is that a good idea?
So that's why it's complicated.
It's not.
Or it's safety, like road safety.
Georgia used not to have, for example, the regulation of, seatbelts, company seatbelt, and we couldn't say that it was necessarily more democratic back then. And afterwards, now we all, are obliged by law.
Yeah.
So there's no such a linear, I think, direct.
For
example, EU is known for its regulations, notorious for its many regulations, but it does not necessarily have to, do anything directly with the level of democracy in this country.
Yeah. Okay. So. Okay. Well, let's get some more views. Okay, Catherine.
Well, Ukraine has also one of the most restrictive smoking regulations in Eastern Europe, but the reason why for the regulation of the smoking behavior is its effect on the public health and other citizens or other people. The same deal is with the public safety. Like if you don't have a buckle up policy and it's not restricted in terms of providing incentive to people to buckle up in the car, it also affects the public safety, meaning affecting you not buckling up may affect me once we are in a car crash, God forbid.
Actually, can you use those concepts and externalities to make an argument in favor of either regulating smoking or forcing people to wear seatbelts? Yeah.
In order to make it the economic ground or financial ground to require this beginning the person smoking, reason people is his health insurance is fully paid.
Right. So in a country where
the cost which and we are damaging, so I have to pay.
Yeah. No, that's right. So that's the.
Very basic.
So we're actually using that framework of externalities to justify this kind of intervention into regulating private behavior, right? So for example, in the United States, so I ride a motorcycle. In some states, there's been a big campaign to get rid of the laws that require motorcyclists to wear helmets. So in Wisconsin, where Harley-Davidson is, you actually don't have to wear a helmet if you ride a motorcycle. And I personally think this is completely crazy that they do this. They do this on general libertarian grounds, like who's the government to tell me whether I ride with a motorcycle helmet or not. But it turns out that there's a lot of studies that have shown that motorcycle head injuries are extremely common among motorcycle riders, and who ends up paying for the hospitalization cost of somebody that ends up with a big head injury because they're not wearing a helmet? It's usually a public hospital, and it's all the other taxpayers that are supporting that hospital that end up paying that cost. And so actually that aspect of behavior, you can make a good argument in terms of externalities. What about things like, like Michelle Obama's been on this big anti-obesity campaign trying to get Americans to slim down. Is that an unwanted intrusion into private behavior, or is this something that can be justified on public policy or public health grounds?
But similar to the helmet and the seatbelt.
Yeah.
Which is linked to the architect's hopes.
Yeah. Okay. So again, it can fall under that category of a negative externality where other people have to pick up the costs of some form of private behavior. Now, there are other aspects of behavior where I don't think you can make much of an economic argument one way. Oops, I'm sorry. Where I don't think you can make an argument. So, for example, in the United States, we've got this big argument about abortion, right? Is abortion legal in Georgia? Yes. Okay, so it became legal in the 1970s because of a Supreme Court decision in the United States, but ever since then it's become, extremely controversial, and people make a rights-based argument one way or the other. The people that want to ban it say that that an embryo has rights as a full human being and ought to be protected, and the people that are in favor of abortion say the mother, the woman, has a right to, and in fact that's the basis on which the Supreme Court made its decision. And there's really not an economic argument in terms of externalities. It's a really deeply troubling moral argument about the status of an embryo and when you become a human being and so forth. And whether the government intervenes or not is something that I don't think can be really decided under the rubric of, this economic framework that we've set up. Okay, I'm not going to express an opinion one way or another, but that's an example where governments do step in to regulate behavior and where there's not a clear, guidance in terms of this framework as to what you end up doing. So there's lots of other things. There's lots of other things that people want to regulate. A lot of times they try to regulate things on public health grounds, as we've been arguing, but their real interest is actually kind of moral, that they want people to behave in a certain way. Like gun violence, it's very interesting in the United States. We're having this big argument over guns because the right really likes the right to bear arms, and liberals, want to have some form of gun control. And one argument that people that want gun control are making is that it's bad for public health, that it's the #1 cause of death among young males in particular, and so they say, well, it ought to be regulated on simply public health grounds. But a lot of people that want guns say, no, that's not the issue. We want guns for hunting, for self-protection. We may have to defend ourselves against a tyrannical government at some point, and so there's a lot of other countervailing issues. So again, I don't want to get into that one way or the other, but there's a question mark at the end of regulating behavior, because this is an area where this earlier framework that I presented you, which is a primarily economic one, does not work, and there's a lot of political controversy. Now, the final issue is the question about providing social safety nets. That is to say, social security, health insurance, other, jobless benefits, workers' compensation, occupational safety and health rules, and the like. All right? Every democracy has a social safety net to a varying degree, but the extent of these social safety nets is very controversial. So we wrote up a case. We're not teaching it in this course, but we wrote up a case actually about your argument here in Georgia over universal health care, right? This is something that the United States still does not have. Almost every other developed democracy has some form of universal health care. The United States was the last to get into this. As you know, President Obama, like one of his biggest legislative accomplishments was Obamacare, so-called Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act that was passed back in 2010. That still falls short of universal health care, and it is really controversial. And in fact, one of the reasons that we now have this big right-wing Tea Party movement in the United States was that after Congress, a Democratic Congress, passed Obamacare, it got so many people on the right angry that it mobilized all these conservative voters whose main objective has been to abolish Obamacare. All right? Now, frankly, I regard this argument as just weird because I think the fact that the United States does not have universal health care is kind of a crazy artifact of American exceptionalism, and the kind of opposition that this has generated is, I think, a little bit irrational, but people will make serious arguments against it. the most important of which is what? And this is something that applies to universal health care in Georgia. Yeah, it's simply a matter of sustainability in fiscal terms. Universal health care is expensive, right? And I think the most cogent arguments about Obamacare are that it's going to add to an already large federal deficit. It's going to lead to the government picking up the bill where other people, private individuals, could actually provide for their own health insurance, and increases people's dependence on the government and the like. And that is, you know, it's actually a reasonable set of arguments. It becomes very technical at that point as to how much it actually costs or not. But as I understand it, that's the issue that you're facing, you know, whether you have means-tested insurance that is directed primarily at poor people that can't afford to pay for their own private insurance, or whether you have some kind of a universal healthcare system. And so again, this framework is not going to tell you anything about how to adjudicate an issue like that. That really has to do with the specific program, how much it costs, what your tax revenues are, what the fiscal basis for paying the program is. And there are indeed certain forms of social safety net that are actually going to bankrupt the country, and there are others that are really necessary and important, and you know, people should be willing to pay for them. So again, there's a question mark at the end of this item because it's not really clear how far we ought to go. All right, so this is a basic framework for thinking about what the government is, what the government does, and how it relates to the private sector. So let me proceed to give you another matrix. So the exit policy. This is something that's done very commonly in East Asia. Yeah?
When the state intervenes into certain sector that it fails to develop itself.
Yeah, so an industrial policy is where the state actually actively tries to promote a certain part of the private sector. All right, so South Korea did not have a petrochemical heavy industry sector in the 1970s, and the South Korean government, through tax subsidies, basically created this sector. Okay, this afternoon we're going to do a case on the Singapore water industry, which was a case of industrial policy where the Singaporean government actually decided to create an export industry in, you know, whose business was providing clean water in other countries, right? So that's an example where you're way out, and that's also very controversial for reasons that we'll get into, whether governments ought to be doing this. All right, so this is the x-axis, the scope of state functions, and a lot of the arguments about what the government ought to do have been about where on that x-axis you are. And here in Georgia, you know, that's been a big issue, right? So under communism, you're way out here. There's no private property. Government centrally controlled, or the old Soviet government controlled prices and the movement of goods. It regulated everything basically. And then after independence, you create a private market. And so you're moving back down this way. And I know, I mean, Kaka Bendukidze was actually a friend of mine. We were both on the board of the RAND Corporation back in California. You know, he was an example of a post-Soviet reformer whose main purpose was to try to move things to the left on that x-axis, right, to get the state out of regulating many things that it had previously regulated, all right? And Americans love to argue about this. They love to argue about where on this axis you ought to be. So the Democrats want to push things out in this direction. They want more government. They want things like Obamacare. You know, they want the government to provide a more generous social safety net. And the Republicans want to push things back down in this direction. They say the government does too much, you know, so on and so forth. So, like I said, we Americans just love arguing about this. I would make the case to you that that's not the most important argument from the standpoint of how the state relates to the private sector, because there is also another axis, which is the y-axis, which here I've labeled the strength of state institutions, but you could also call it the quality of government, you could call it state capacity, and the like. And that really has to do with how well does the government perform any given function, okay? So the government can do ambitious things, it can do minimal things, but any one of those functions it can do better or worse. So you take a basic function like police. Very few people would argue that the government doesn't have an obligation to provide for public safety, but as we know, many governments are terrible at protecting their citizens from ordinary crime. Again, in the former Soviet space, this was a big issue. You know, after the collapse of the Soviet state, there was a huge increase just in ordinary crime because state couldn't, you know, provide that function. In Latin America, we're not doing any Latin American, well, no, actually we are doing one Latin American case, but the single biggest problem in Brazil, Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala is crime, just drug trafficking, you know, ordinary citizens being extorted on the streets because the government cannot run, you know, you've probably followed this thing with El Chapo, this drug lord in Mexico that managed to escape twice from a maximum security Mexican prison, right? It was highly embarrassing to the government of Mexico because their police force is so riddled with corruption that any drug lord can simply buy his way out of prison as this guy did, right? So a very basic function over which nobody would argue the state doesn't have a responsibility, and yet, you know, Mexico is a middle-income country. I mean, I think the per capita income of Mexico is probably around $10,000, $12,000 in parity purchasing power terms. So it's a, you know, it's a pretty rich country, and yet it cannot provide this basic function because there's too much corruption in the Mexican police at all different levels, all right? So that's an issue for this y-axis. This is a case where the quality of government in, you know, this country is very poor, and the solution, you know, nobody would say the solution is to move one way or the other, because in something like controlling narco trafficking, you know, there's nobody else that's going to do it. The government doesn't do it. It's not going to be done privately. So the question is, how do you move up and down that y-axis and get better quality? And I would say corruption is probably, you know, in the post-Cold War world, it's probably become the single most important thing that distinguishes good states and good government from bad government, okay? What would you, so this is, to this audience, this is a little bit of a prejudiced question, but what would you say is the biggest problem with the Vladimir Putin's government in Russia right now? Is it the fact that it is not democratic, or is it the fact that it is highly corrupt? Okay. Yeah.
It's not a really problem for them because this is the foundation on which this government is. Otherwise, the government without corruption doesn't exist. So it's like kind of concrete, however paradoxical.
Okay, so, but let me just pose it in these terms. If there's an election held in Russia tomorrow to re-elect the president, who would win? Putin, right? There's no question about that. I mean, there isn't a poll that doesn't say that he's not extremely popular. So actually, in terms of democratic choice, he is actually the choice of the Russian people to be president, right? So if you're saying that the problem, you know, I just don't think that of all the things, bad things you can say about President Putin, the fact that he is not the democratically, you know, selected leader of Russia is not at the top of the list, okay? And I would actually say that the bigger problem with the Russian government right now is actually the problem of corruption. It is the fact that, you know, the Russian elite is, you know, what economists would call a rent-seeking coalition of people who benefit from their access to political power, right? And they suck resources out of the system for their own private benefit. That's the real big problem. And they have so many resources that they can buy the media, they can control public opinion in Russia, and then they can get everybody to vote for them because, you know, they're in control of all these resources. So I would say that the big problem in Russia is actually not a lack of democratic legitimacy for the current government. It is a fact that it is a kleptocracy, what's called a kleptocracy, meaning that it is, based on the private appropriation of public resources by powerful people. And in Ukraine, I think that this is exactly the problem that Ukraine has to solve, right? Everybody knows that corruption was one of the big things that brought down the earlier democratic experiment in the Orange Revolution, that the Yushchenko, Timoshenko government couldn't get a handle on public corruption, and that delegitimized that government. That's what led to the return of Mr. Yanukovych, who again was democratically elected president of Ukraine. And I think unless Poroshenko's government manages to get hold of this problem, it's going to suffer the same fate as the Orange Coalition did back in 2004. All right, so I would say that this y-axis is really pretty important in terms of determining outcomes, social outcomes in different countries. So don't take my word for it. Let's put a few numbers in here. So this chart is again based on World Bank data. So the World Bank, as you probably know, the World Bank Institute for the last 10 years or so has been publishing these so-called worldwide governance indicators. There are 6 indicators that they track. All of them are aggregates. The bank doesn't collect its own data on this. They simply aggregate other people's measures of the quality of government. So there are 6 of them. One is voice and accountability. Another is control of violence. Another is regulatory quality. These 2 have to do with control of corruption and government effectiveness. And every year the bank publishes statistics for all 180 countries around the world. You can download it from their website. And so this simply arranges countries from the most corrupt and the least effective to the most effective. As you can see, government effectiveness and corruption correlate very heavily with one another. So ineffective governments are also ones that tend to be highly corrupt, although that is not a universal correlation. There are some countries like China where the relationship is a little bit more complicated. And I don't think anybody's ranking on this chart is going to surprise anyone. Yes. Yeah. South Korea, that it's down there, yeah. No, North Korea is way down here somewhere. Yeah, North Korea is here. South Korea is kind of in the middle along with Japan. So you're actually, why are you surprised? Who said they were surprised? Why are you surprised?
Somehow I thought South Korea was not very bad in terms of control of corruption.
Yeah, well, this is based on perceptions by businessmen. In South Korea, there's a lot of money in politics. And there are these very powerful industrial groups called chaebol who fund politicians, and and the same thing goes on in Japan, which is why Japan is ranked kind of towards the bottom of the upper half of this distribution, because Japan has been notorious for a kind of money politics in which the ruling party uses its resource to get its people reelected. So I think that's probably the reason for them being there. But I don't think anyone is surprised that Singapore, Denmark, the Netherlands are kind of at the top of the... Now, I should have redone this. I should have put Georgia into this. Where do you think Georgia will end up in this? Yeah, well, it'll be... Yeah, well, this is where it's interesting, because I think probably... In fact, I'll look this up and I'll put up a new chart, because over time we can track where Georgia's been. Since the Rose Revolution, Georgia's standing on these indicators has risen. It's risen in the doing business indicators as well. There's a number of areas where there's been a deliberate effort by the government to raise Georgia's international rankings. But conversely, the countries that are really bad, nobody would be surprised that it's Somalia, North Korea, Afghanistan, Nigeria, and the like, all right? Now, the argument I'm going to make to you is that it's actually this ranking. So this is the y-axis. This is the quality of government axis. And my argument is that although we tend to argue about how big the government ought to be, the more important determinant of how well you do economically is actually what the quality of your government is. And to demonstrate that, all right, so actually let's think about this theoretically. So here's the scope of state functions, all right? Minimal government, large government, and then poor quality government, high quality government, all right? From the standpoint of economic growth, if all you're interested in is maximizing economic growth, which means maximizing the performance of your private sector, which of these quadrants would you prefer to be in? One, all right? Anyone want to make another argument? Anyone think that you ought to be in quadrant 2? Nobody? Okay, good. We got somebody, yeah, we got a couple of people that would say quadrant 2. 50-50, all right, you could be in either. So I think this ends up being largely an ideological choice. Most Americans would say we should be in quadrant 1 with a limited government, minimal state, but high quality. A lot of Europeans, you know, the Dutch and certainly everyone in Scandinavia would say we ought to be in quadrant 2. So where do actual countries line up in this distribution? So this is not a random sample, but it's very illustrative. So on this one, I've actually plugged some real numbers in. So we can measure the scope of government in terms of what percentage of GDP is taken by the state in taxes, right? So the more that you tax, the larger your state is going to be. So it goes from, you know, countries that only tax 10% of GDP up to ones that tax as much as 50% of all of the national wealth that's produced. And then the government effectiveness, I'm simply using that World Bank measure that I showed on that previous slide, how they rank in these worldwide governance indicators rankings. And this is what you get. There's actually a positive correlation between the size of the government and its quality. And there are many, especially European, especially Northern European governments that are very large in terms of how much they tax their citizens and how effective their governments are. Yes?
I have a question. If this shows how much money is taken in taxes, does it necessarily mean that, because like in Scandinavia, for example, there are huge taxes and they go for the social net and redistribution of wealth. So, but does it necessarily mean that it's a big government in terms of how big it is? What is the direct correlation between?
Well, so this is very complicated. It's hard to measure the degree of state intervention in an economy simply through taxation. So for example, you'll see that Japan and Singapore are kind of in the middle of the distribution, meaning that their tax rates are not as high as they are in continental Europe, all right? Especially Singapore doesn't tax all that much. On the other hand, both of those countries are highly interventionist in terms of industrial policy. As we will see, they actually have spent a lot of time trying to promote individual industries in a way that doesn't require taxation, but it does mean that the government regulates and, you know, basically they direct credits and subsidies to certain favored industries. And so in that respect, they've actually got large governments. Yeah.
So just to clarify, when you say big governments, do you mean a number of actually people in public? No, and how much money you spend on the government, or do you mean the level of or the extent of the intervention by the government?
Well, it really is much more the extent of intervention. But the thing is that the extent of intervention also tends to correlate quite highly with tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, because, you know, what is it the government spend money on? They spend money on pensions, on healthcare, on police, on national defense. All of those things require money, right? And if you don't tax your citizens, well, you can run a deficit, in which case you get into trouble down the road, but basically all of those things require money. And so, you know, this is so this is not a perfect measure of the size of government, but it is a proxy. The percentage of GDP taken in taxes is one commonly used proxy for the scope of government, how big government is. Like I said, it doesn't, there's some qualitative things like industrial policy, which wouldn't be captured by this measure, but that are, and things like regulating, let's say regulating smoking or helmets or things like that won't show up on this measure because they're not that expensive to do, but they are ways that states intervene, and so this is not a perfect measure, but it's just one way of thinking about things, okay? Now, I guess the thing that I would like to point out about this chart is the following. What's the base, like just looking at this chart, what message do you come away with just from seeing where different countries around the world that you're familiar with, where they end up in this distribution? Like, what does it mean to be a developed country? Yeah, I mean, every developed country is in the top half of this chart, right? And poor countries are in the bottom half. Now, what I think is significant is that there are some rich countries that have relatively smaller state sectors, and there are some rich countries that have relatively large state sectors, all right? But there are no rich countries that have poor quality government. And I would say almost the definition of being a less developed country is to be in the bottom half, and the worst place of all that you can be in is in that quadrant 3, where the government doesn't do very much, and whatever it does very poorly. So Afghanistan is a classic case of this. The Afghan government, one of my colleagues did this calculation where the Afghan government on a per capita basis, meaning for every citizen in Afghanistan, what would you guess the government spends? So Afghanistan has got, what, about 25, 30 million people. So what would you guess per citizen the Afghan government has to spend? It isn't very much. So, well, it's less than $100. It's about $70 per citizen. And that $70 has to cover security, regulation, education, healthcare, all the things that governments do. And then it turns out that of that $70, if you take away the money that is given by international donors, the amount falls to about $17 per citizen, right? So you think to yourself, what can a government do with $17 per capita, in terms of public spending, in terms of providing all of those necessary public goods, regulating externalities, and so forth. And that's why Afghanistan is such a mess. And I would say, most failed states are down very close to the origins of the X and Y axes. They don't tax very much, they don't have much in terms of resources, and whatever they do, it's of very low quality. And that's why they're failed states or extremely poor, right? And so this means that when you think about the state and the private sector, you've got to think about not just, this old argument, do we want bigger government or smaller government? I mean, that's important. That's an important issue. But you also need to think about the quality of government. How do you move up and down that Y-axis? So if you think about how different countries have moved, this is actually not based on real data. This is just kind of a notional idea. So China was a Maoist communist country back in 1978 at the end of the Cultural Revolution. No private property. They create a private market. So they move this way on the X-axis, but the whole time they're improving the quality of Chinese government. And one of the things that distinguishes, let's say, China from Russia today is the fact that the quality of Chinese government is much higher. I mean, there's a lot of corruption in China. There's no question about that, but it doesn't reach, I think, nearly to the levels that it does in Russia. If you look at Russia, unfortunately, I think they've moved in kind of negative directions, and so they were also a state centralized command economy. They privatized a lot. The quality of government fell very dramatically in the 1990s. President Putin has moved things back into the state sector, certainly increased the scope of the Russian government. He's done almost nothing, I think, to improve the quality of government. And in fact, in many respects, it's worse than it was previously. One positive example is New Zealand, where they reduced the size of the state sector in the 1980s under their finance minister, Roger Douglas, but then they undertook a very comprehensive effort to reform their public sector under the heading of New Public Management, which I'll describe further in a later lecture. And so every country you can trace on this two-dimensional axis. And so just to summarize, what does this mean in terms of how do you use government to improve the performance of the private sector? There are basically three vectors. There are three arrows, right? First reform path is to actually increase the scope of what the government does in terms of providing basic public services, things that are not controversial: clean water, infrastructure, electricity, education, public health, right? These are all things that governments really need to do, and there's no good private sector substitute for them. People have experimented with that, and we're going to, Professor Traeger is going to talk a lot about public-private partnerships in which you bring the private sector into the provision of some of these goods, but these are essentially things that are fundamentally government responsibilities, so the government needs to do more. In other cases, you need to move the opposite direction, where the government is over-regulating, there's too much red tape. This is a lot of the stuff that the Georgian government did in the 2000s under Saakashvili. But then finally, there's this third arrow where you can improve quality by dealing with corruption, increasing state capacity, essentially making the government more effective in doing whatever it was setting out to do in the first place. And what you're going to see in all of the cases that we're going to do is that we're going to move in one of these three directions. So some of the cases will be about increasing the ability of the government to do basic public goods and services. Some of it will involve getting the government out of the way and getting it to stop doing things that it shouldn't be doing. And some will be dealing with corruption and improving the quality of government. And as you go through the cases, you should think, which of these three paths are we talking about? Is this the case of getting the government to do more, getting it to do less, or getting it to do something better? And that's essentially the framework that I want to leave you with as the beginning of this course. So this will be the subject of a separate discussion. By and large, there is a strong correlation between the quality of your government and the degree of democracy. So if you look around the world, you have the same set of countries that have high quality government, good quality democracy, strong rule of law, and are rich, right? These are the EU countries, the United States, Japan, so on and so forth. However, this is the real challenge that's being raised by East Asia, because there are many East Asian countries that have gotten quite rich, like Singapore, which we're going to study this afternoon, South Taiwan, both underwent economic miracles under military governments. You have China, which is probably the single biggest challenge to this system that is getting extremely rich, under a communist authoritarian dictatorship. And so the correlation between democracy and high quality government and wealth is overall, it's a pretty strong correlation, but it is not a perfect correlation. And that's one of the things we need to think about. And in fact, this is the subject, maybe we'll get into this in the Night Owl sessions, but I think that people who live in democracies and are making democratic transitions really have to worry about the quality of government as a separate issue that's kind of separate from how democratic they are. And I think that's one of the big failings that Many countries like Ukraine that are trying to transition into being full democracies have not dealt with the quality of government issue. They've not dealt with corruption. They've not dealt with poor public services. And that is what is delegitimating them. And unless they get hold of that issue, they're not going to be successful in their transformations.